Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, demand is back, but so is disruption. Now the blame game is underway as airlines struggle to keep pace as services ramp up. And what needs to happen next as the industry plots a course to net zero by 2050? This episode of the Airline Business Podcast is brought to you by GE Aviation. My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, good, not too bad at all. And here we are in the UK. We just enjoyed a celebratory weekend, and for airlines, especially in the UK, but not exclusively there, it's not been a very celebratory weekend.
No, it isn't. It's kind of the headlines. I mean, we've talked about this. We kind of relaunched the podcast only in a few episodes, and it feels like we can't get away from this topic because it is kind of certainly, as you say, in the UK, dominating the mainstream media, even before we think about what we're covering. So yeah, it continues to be a big story. It's a situation that doesn't seem to be getting any better. And I think because in the UK it's been going on and on now for a while, and people are worried about what is going to come when we reach July, August kind of school holiday time, when it really is the peak of summer demand. I think there's almost a switch now towards more of a blame game.
Yeah, and I think for airlines it's particularly galling. I mean, whether all airlines have handled the situations as well as they might do is sort of another question, I guess. But certainly the idea that airlines who still in January had no idea whether they were going to be able to operate this summer, and the one consistent message airlines gave throughout this crisis has been, we need some sort of certainty in terms of what the operating environment's going to be like. And so that is, without question, that does become a challenge, doesn't it?
Yeah, so what we've seen is, more than one, I think, minister from the UK government has come out and suggested that UK airlines did not staff up properly for the summer. So it's essentially their fault what's happening. So it's not just airlines, of course, this is an issue across the chain, really, and including, obviously, airports, where there's quite a lot of high-profile stories about the queues we're seeing there. But as you say, it's a bit galling for the industry to hear that. They've been through the biggest crisis in the industry's history. As you say, in January, we were still dealing with the Omicron variant that had, if airlines didn't want some visibility about, 2022, that was really kiboshed by the arrival of the Omicron variant. And it really wasn't until we're into February that there was a strong sense that wasn't quite going to be the set things back too badly. And it's not unreasonable to suggest that maybe a business that at that point was suddenly confident enough to start taking on overstaffing and things like that would have been considered quite reckless given what's just happened. I mean, there's an understandable instinct to be cautious. But having said that, obviously airlines choose their schedules. They've committed to them. They've been selling them. But there are plenty more reasons why this is happening. And it's clearly will be an element somewhere where maybe the industry will learn from this. But for anyone to come out and say the industry is to blame for this, I think is a bit rich, particularly when it comes from the government. And I'm not suggesting the government was doing anything wrong by being cautious about the COVID, but this is just the reality of what we've been living through.
I think what we have seen is, when we spoke about this a month or so ago, airlines at the time thought they were taking steps, taking measures to get this. They were cutting some flights out of the schedule. EasyJet was talking, it's quite innovative way of having less seats on board some of its aircraft. So airlines were doing things, and I think there was a feel they could keep pace with it. But those holiday spikes in traffic they're difficult for the airline ecosystem to keep up with in the best of times, let alone in this ramp up period.
Yeah, it is an overused word, but it is unprecedented what airlines have been through and coming out of it. I think this whole story is interesting, again, from the UK perspective, is because they're related issues, but, big queues at airports, disruption there, and the cancellation of flights aren't necessarily the same thing. And actually, when you look at the hard data, the number of flights being cancelled historically is a bit up on what we saw pre-COVID in the equivalent, let's just say the May half term we've just seen. But it's not unusual for there to be disruption around this time, in pre-COVID time. So there's kind of just a perfect storm of stories happening here, and it all gets mixed up in one. And clearly, anecdotally, we've been talking about, I think it feels like anyone on a short-haul flight from the UK at the moment seems to have some level of disruption to that, whether it's flight change or cancellation or whatever. So yeah, it's a big deal, but particularly when you're affected directly by it. But yeah, it's the reasoning for it goes And again, in a UK perspective, as you go beyond that, a global perspective, in a lot of economies, there's a shortage of available labour at the moment. That's not an issue that's unique to the airline industry. Again, when we talk about the government blaming airlines for this, I think the government will also acknowledge that in service sectors, for example, across the economy, there's a shortage of staff. And there are particular reasons why the airline industry and that service sector as a whole is struggling in that environment, because hours can be antisocial. People who were let go by airlines, airports during the pandemic might have found jobs that are 9 to 5, get their weekends back, that kind of thing. And when there's a shortage of available staff, people will be offered jobs on decent terms that will perhaps give them more of a social life, for example. So yeah, there's kind of a bit of a challenge, and the key point beyond the blame game is what actually happens next. And you touched on it. We know that this was foreseen to a point. More than one airline was talked about this summer being a challenge from a staffing perspective, and essentially within that is an admission that there's only so much they can do, and other things playing into this, weather issues, ATC issues. Yeah, there's lots of things in play that have made it worse, and then obviously it just gets exacerbated. So airlines, it's not unusual, as we know in pre-COVID times, for there to be an IT meltdown, for example. But if you get a minor IT issue on top of not having enough staff on standby, suddenly there's a chain reaction. You've got flights delayed, cancelled everywhere. So it's a tough one, and I guess as I say, the point is how's this going to resolve itself? And I think unfortunately that given some of the underlying issues are economy wide, there is a point where clearly perhaps the airline and air travel industry is going to have to be more competitive to get the staff in, but also perhaps certainly over the next few months and possibly beyond, there maybe needs to be more of that lateral thinking we've seen from the likes of EasyJet on reducing seats on flights and making sure they can serve the flights that they sell, and that we aren't in this situation where we are.
And this situation is really surreal, really, in terms of to what extent you could predict this was coming. This is both a negative and a positive story. And the positive story is the strength of demand. Even with inflation, cost of living pressure put on people, demand has managed to stay incredibly strong during this, despite a string of factors which might make you think, people will be tightening their belts and so forth. Now, all of that feels like it might still be there, but just not this summer.
This is the thing, as you say, we I guess if we hadn't had COVID and we had all the economic pressures we have at the moment, I think that you would be thinking, well, this summer's not going to be great. But as you say, what's unusual about this situation is what demand appears to be holding it. And I think part of talking about the reasons for the challenges, operational challenges in some markets at the moment, is that demand is really trending above what industry expected looking into this summer. We all talked about pent up demand, but we're never quite sure, whether it was going to come back. And I remember in the dark days of the pandemic, discussions about, is this a fundamental change in the level of demand for travel? Listening to Ed Bastian, Delta CEO, talking the other day, he's saying that consequence of the pandemic will be that people travel more, so that the kind of travel demand will settle at a higher level than we saw in 2019, because people don't take it for granted anymore. So lots of the doom-laden predictions maybe during COVID, and it was difficult predictions not to take on that character during some of the points over the past 2 years. But what we're seeing is very strong demand in leisure markets particularly, and that's not helping the situation because so many people want to travel, and airlines in the early build up to these kind of busier weeks would have been confidently adding flights in, or holding firm on their schedules, thinking, well, this demand is looking fantastic. And unfortunately in some markets we've ended up in this sort of messy situation. In another world, this would have been absolute boom time, and and the point it still will be. And I think what's going to be interesting is when we get the results into this period as well from airlines, and some of the kind of hard data on exactly how many flights they're operating and that kind of thing. We'll get some clarity soon.
Yes, we'll have more. One of the key bits of clarity we'll also get is from IATA, which holds its annual general meeting in June. Myself and this will be, assuming our flights are operate as planned, will be
COVID tests,
all the usual bits and pieces will be at the AGM, in which there'll be a fresh industry profits outlook issued as well. And we'll be doing a couple of podcasts from there as well. So look out for that. And one of the other key issues, which is going to be discussed at the AGM, and which we're going to talk about after the break, is sustainability and airlines' efforts to cut their emissions. And we'll talk about that shortly. This episode of the Airline Business Podcast is brought to you by GE Aviation. GE Aviation believes the world works better when it flies. That's why they're helping the industry shape the future of more sustainable flight by supporting development of 100% SAF to run in all GE engines. See what GE is doing today for the benefit of us all tomorrow at ge-to-netzero.com.
If you're enjoying this podcast, why not sign up for the free weekly airline business briefing delivered direct to your inbox every Thursday. You can register to get our weekly briefing together with any of Flight Global's other newsletters for free at flightglobal.com/newsletter.
Welcome back, and at the last AGM that IATA held, there was a landmark agreement, global resolution for airlines to get to reach net zero on carbon emissions by 2050. And that was a significant step because it brought all the airlines together, and as everyone knows within the environment, different countries, different regions, they're working at different paces. So to get a collective agreement to reach net zero by 2050 was a significant step which provided the framework for airlines to cut their emissions. But 2050 is some time off. And it's certainly not going to be achieved with a single step, is it?
No, and the roadmap that IATA put out with that resolution is a movable feast, I think, but ultimately contains a number of different factors that will contribute towards the net zero. And what I think is being crystallised at the moment is, while that was an achievement, as you say, but really there's a sense now that the tough work is ahead. And as you say, particularly in the short term, I'm talking the next 5 to 10 years, the question is, what happens now, and how do where are steps possible over that time frame, right? Let's be honest, options are a bit limited at the moment.
It is, yeah, and it's definitely true that when IATA drew up its roadmap, and IATA was speaking to Willie Walsh, the Director General, a few weeks ago, he was sort of very clear that they wanted to come up with a credible plan which wasn't reliant on technological developments, overly so. So whether that's electric, whether that's hydrogen, whether that's a different form of propulsion improvement that could happen. But the focus, in order to have a credible plan, is to start thinking about what can you do with what's available today. And one of the key focuses on that is sustainable aviation fuel, isn't it?
Exactly, because when you think about how airline fleet renewal works, even if there was an amazing hydrogen breakthrough in 10, 15 years time, which Airbus is kind of hoping to get there around that time frame, it's not going to be that suddenly airlines have got 50% of their fleets hydrogen powered. And when you're looking at 2050, suddenly seems quite close when you're thinking in terms of fleet renewal. So as you say, it's really stuff, and the credibility is so important, particularly when, as I say, the levers available at the moment are quite small. SAF is a really important area, and there are areas where it's been proven that progress can be made, and I think SAF is one of those areas, but at the moment there's such a tiny amount available. Airlines are jumping on what's available, and there's an announcement the other day from United, for example, another deal for them, and available SAF does not hang around because there isn't much of it, and even under the more ambitious plans for how much the proportion of fuel offtake that it will be in the coming decade or so, we're barely getting out of the single percentages. So, but it is an area where you can demonstrate progress today, and it is an area, if you talk to people as well, that there is a thing that maybe it could be one where we look back in the future and the way airlines were thinking of it was being overly cautious, and the industry really does take off quite quickly. So SAF is a really big one, and I'm hoping that the IATA AGM, I'm fairly sure we will hear SAF mentioned quite regularly, because it is a lever airlines can pull, because beyond that it gets a bit murky as well when you start talking about offsetting.
And offsetting, I think, is the two things that can be done today: SAF and sort of pushing and developing that market, trying to create the market dynamics which create it as a sustainable business model for all players involved. Even that's going to take a little bit of time. Offsetting, that is the action that can be done today, that is being done today. We're seeing it with the Corsair scheme. To some extent, that there almost needs, there's a double downing on it and almost adding more kind of robustness to those programs.
again, it's something that will get more and more scrutiny, I think, over time, particularly as we say over the next 5 to 10 years, because offsetting, I almost view it as the kind of it's the fallback position if nothing else is available. And you talk to airline chiefs and people leading sustainability airlines, and they always qualify any talk of offsetting by saying, we don't want this to be, spearheading our sustainability effort, but it's something we can do today. But as you say, I think the quality of those projects is absolutely critical and will become more so. I mean, there's a certain group of people who will just dismiss offsetting, and say it is papering over the cracks, and ultimately it's not reducing. In a sense, it's enabling emissions by giving airlines an out that doesn't address the fundamental issue. But I think quite reasonably other people will point out, well, if we don't do that, then at the moment there's only so much else we can do, as we just touched on there. There's hardly any SAF available. Plenty of airlines have been investing millions, billions in updating their fleet with the latest technology. Arguably they'd have done that anyway without the sustainability kind of shooting up the agenda. But there aren't that many levers they can pull that really make a fundamental difference. So the offsetting's here to stay. We know that. You look at the EU ETS or Corsia on the international stage are kind of underpinning what I think airlines could do now. And as you say, the quality of those products, so making sure that the offsetting that's being done is actually into projects that do reduce carbon and do some good. Because it's when we talk about greenwashing, for example, I think airlines probably be increasingly exposed to accusations of that, particularly when other industries are able to decarbonise much more quickly over the coming 5-10 years.
I'm seeing when I speak to airlines, more at them taking a sort of a less passive approach, and they want genuine customer buy-in. We're seeing it embedded much more into loyalty programs, into and this is all part of, I think, a kind of wider trend of trying to get sort of alignment of thought with their customers, because I think they recognise that the customers and passengers want airlines to decarbonise as quickly as possible as well, and be a kind of ethical choice.
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about in the first half, I don't think there's any doubt that people want to fly it, and as this summer is proving, and yeah, as you say, people do want that choice, and you thinking about strategies for the coming years, I think that engagement is important, in giving customers that opportunity to offset their flights and particularly when you talk about corporate customers as well, not just talking about individual customers paying for flights. This is it's going to be a key pillar, and the messaging is so important around that, is that making sure it's seen as part of the journey. As no one in the industry will be saying, well, offsetting is the answer to this, because we know that as we talk about SAF, whether it's SAF, hydrogen, even the next generation of turbofans, everyone's working towards something better, genuine reductions in emissions. So yeah, it's going to be an important part of that. But yeah, that whole messaging thing as well is really interesting to look at how different airlines are approaching this. And I think there are some carriers that you could view as being at the forefront of really trying to make the sustainability, and it's very hard not to sound woolly talking about this, but you're kind of making it part of what you do in everything. And what you're also doing is kind of inviting your customers to engage with it, and it's not entirely on the airlines to do everything with this. And I'm not just talking about, clearly airlines can't do this on their own technology wise, for example. It's a whole chain of things with SAF, it's governments, but it goes beyond that, and it's engaging passengers in things that they can do to get the weight of the aircraft down, for example. Do you need 2 25 kilogram cases on this flight? That kind of thing. You've got to be careful doing that, because you don't want to make it seem too much like it's all down to the customers. But there is a level of doing, I think there's a way of doing that. I think an airline like Finnair is an example that probably does that quite well. It's talking to its customers about it. And it's not just about, every 6 months, well, we need to do a quick marketing campaign on sustainability, or here's how we're better than everyone else based on these metrics that we've conveniently chosen. So yeah, there is a really massive challenge for airlines, but they've got to bring everyone on that journey with them.
And not that things aren't progressing in the technology field. There's all sorts of work underway. One of the key areas is engine propulsion. Just point you in the direction if you want to know more about the challenges and the progress of that. Flight Club has its very own hydrogen and electrics webinar, which you can find details on the flightglobal.com website. It's on the 9th of June, but it's available to replay if you're listening to this after the 9th of June, which is entirely possible. And that will bring you up to speed with the various moves around the potential for hydrogen, the potential of hybrid engines and electric aircraft, which, ultimately are going to paint that second opportunity for airlines to get towards that net zero growth.
Yeah, I don't think, as we touched on earlier, that's going to be a big percentage. I think, most acknowledge technology is going to drive a percentage of it, but as I say, that might be the next generation of turbofan engines, or everyone keeping the options open really on the more game-changing stuff. I guess
everyone's got plates spinning at the moment, and I'm sure lots of people have their own bets on which will be the most promising. But the engine manufacturers are trying lots of different things. The airlines are trying lots of different things, keeping options open. And at this stage, we're in this exploratory period, I guess.
It is hard to talk about the industry as a whole in this sustainability context because there are so many plates spinning. But what's interesting, you talk to some people, there is a desire in the industry as well that maybe for some common standards on sustainability. I think that's something to watch out for, and it'd be interesting if that comes up at the IATA AGM, because I think that would really help the industry. We see some airlines with a habit of will try and claim they're more green than their competitors based on ASKs or whatever measurement they choose. But the reality is, another airline could equally find another measurement. What's interesting is, like ISO standards we're used to, and airline safety is an area where the industry is obviously clearly very good at having set standards that everyone has to adhere to and can be measured by. I think what will be interesting is seeing if that develops over time, because again, when we talk about the challenges of proving you're doing enough in the era of really tentative steps towards real sustainability breakthroughs, I think having a set of common standards that shows, as a business we are achieving all of this. It may not be adding up to much at the moment, but we're doing all that can be expected of us or is asked of us, then that would help a lot. And I think that may be something we need to keep an eye on going forward. And I think that would be a big help for the industry, and I'm sure we'll see something on that at some point.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Another thing that we need to wait for, unfortunately, though, when it comes to sustainability.
Well, thank you, Lewis. We will, as I say, we'll have some special podcasts which are coming around the IATA AGM, which is the 18th, 20th of June, something like that. I hope so,
because I think that's when I'm in Doha.
Yeah. So we'll be, so look out for some special podcasts around that period. Thank you, Lewis, for your time.
Thanks, Greg.
That's all we have time for this time. Our thanks to GE Aviation for their support on making this podcast episode happen. You can find links to the stories we've referenced in the podcast notes, and you can keep up to date with all the latest on how airlines are faring in their recovery efforts at flightglobal.com. If you are interested in sustainability, we also have a new sustainable aviation focused newsletter, which we are launching later in June. This is available to get for free. Same address as before, flightglobal.com/newsletters. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. And we'll see you again next time.